Welcome. This is a training on the Rental Assistance Demonstration, or RAD, specifically on public housing conversions. I'm going to start off with some background. First, why do we have a conversion option for public housing properties to convert under RAD? RAD was designed to help address the large and growing backlog of capital needs in public housing that in 2010 was estimated at $26 billion. At that time, there were thousands of public housing units that were leaving the inventory through demolition and disposition each year. And the public housing program was understood to be on a regulatory and funding platform that was inhibiting access to capital and to predictable revenue streams. So originally authorized in 2011 and subsequently amended, RAD now allows up to 455,000 public housing units to convert to long-term Section 8 rental assistance contracts. These contracts provide access to debt and equity to finance capital needs, a strong platform for long-term preservation, program simplification, where PHAs can consolidate their programs onto the Section 8 platform, and a robust set of resident rights. That actually covers multiple programs. Today's presentation is focused on public housing, but I want to briefly mention that there's also an option for owners of Section 8 moderate rehabilitation properties, McKinney-Vento, mod rehab SROs, rental assistance payments, rent supplements, and now Section 202 PRAC properties to also convert under RAD. All of these different portfolios through RAD can get to the Section 8 platform, either to project-based rental assistance or to project-based vouchers. Again, this presentation will focus on the public housing conversion options. PHAs have used RAD successfully so far for a number of reasons and to achieve a number of objectives. That include modernizing aging family and elderly properties, stabilizing property revenue, even if they're not doing any new financing right now, substantial rehab of deteriorated properties, to demolish and redevelop distressed or obsolete properties, to transfer assistance out of the existing property and to properties in better neighborhoods, to thin densities at sites or increase density at sites to mix incomes, or to streamline operations. We'll now dive into the key program requirements of RAD. First, I want to point you to some of the critical program resources. That includes the RAD statute, which because it's been amended multiple times, we've posted a consolidated version on our website. We have the RAD implementation notice, which is a large notice that is split up into sections for each conversion type. So public housing conversions is section 1 of the notice. We have a fair housing, civil rights, and relocation notice specifically dedicated to covering these topics in the context of public housing conversions. And we have multiple guides and FAQs that provide greater in-depth technical assistance on various topics, such as capital needs assessment, environmental reviews, rent flexibilities, financing plans, and many, many more. Finally, for PHAs that are early in considering whether RAD is a good option, we've published a RAD inventory assessment tool, which allows a PHA to relatively quickly assess the financial impact of RAD at their property. So digging into the details some more, let's talk about the contract terms and rents that result at the end of a RAD conversion. So one of the key advantages of RAD is we have a predictable initial contract rent setting scheme. Rents are based on public housing funding levels, which we'll talk about on the next slide, and those levels can then be modified potentially with certain flexibilities that we have published in a guide. Once converted into a Section 8 HAP contract, those contract rents adjust each year by an operating cost adjustment factor. So there's a steady inflation rate to the revenue the property can expect. HAP funding begins at construction closing. So even if there is construction or rehab going on and possibly residents need to be moved out, the property still has a source of revenue. While operating, there's no limitation on the use of project cash flow. Cash flow is unrestricted. And then the two contracts that are executed at closing, the HAP contract and the RAD use agreement, both renew at each expiration of the HAP contract. So the HAP contract will go for 20 years. At the end of that 20-year term, we'll renew. At the end of that 20-year term, we'll renew again, and on and on. So going back to the initial contract rent setting, this slide demonstrates how those rents are set. So for every public housing property in the country, it today is supported through the operating fund, capital fund, and collected tenant rents. We've put these numbers together to come up with what the Section 8 contract rent is. So for the operating fund, each property is funded at the property level, so we know this amount. Similarly, rents are collected at the property level, so we know what this amount is for every public housing property. The capital fund, while provided to the PHA as a lump sum grant, is actually calculated at the project level too. So we take these three amounts, we put them together, and we come up with a number for this sample property at $792. Once converted onto Section 8, that's the number that's in the HAP contract. $792 is the contract rent. So the next day, when the tenant is paying $318, the HAP payment, the subsidy, is now $474. If tenant rent goes up, the HAP subsidy goes down. If the tenant rent goes down, the HAP subsidy goes up. So what's important to the owner is, what is that number? In this case, $792. They know that's the amount that they'll get as they occupy units to eligible households. This is immensely important, both for the owner's long-term budget planning, understanding its revenue and expenses, but then it is also critical because you can actually take this to the bank. A bank will underwrite to this amount, as they've done for the last 40 years in the Section 8 world. So PHAs commonly use a variety of financing sources in their RAD conversions. We'll go through each in turn. So first mortgage debt. This is something that commonly used in all kinds of affordable housing, but which is restricted in public housing. PHAs have used either FHA insured debt, which includes 223F for light mod rehab loans, or 221D4 for sub-rehab or new construction loans. Those are just different loan products that the FHA offers. As an alternative to FHA insured debt, many PHAs and owners have used conventional debt. Very common in RAD transactions are the use of low-income housing tax credit. Most common because it's generally available in most states at the 4% line low-income housing tax credit, which is provided as of right when there's an award of private activity bonds to a property. A number of RAD conversions have also successfully competed for 9% tax credits. Obviously, those are more competitive and more constrained, but we've certainly had a number of RAD conversions that have successfully secured 9% tax credits, particularly when trying to do demolition and new construction of the property. We also see a fair amount of use of historic tax credits, as public housing properties have, many public housing properties have been designated as historic over the years. Key in RAD is PHAs can use public housing funds to support the development budget in a RAD conversion. This includes operating reserves, capital funds, demolition, disposition, transition funding, sales proceeds. These funds can be put into the deal as either a grant or as a soft loan, and can be used, like any of these sources, either to support initial repairs or possibly just to capitalize a new reserve for the property if the property is in decent shape. And then, again, it's customary in general affordable housing financing. Commonly, we see homes, CDBG, the New Housing Trust Fund, or Federal Home Loan Bank Affordable Housing Program funds. Okay, so public housing properties can convert either to project-based vouchers or to project-based rental assistance. Over the next two slides, we'll talk through each just to get a basic understanding of the difference. We have a more thorough side-by-side comparison of these two available on our website. So project-based vouchers are, the funding is congressionally appropriated through the tenant-based rental assistance account. That's because project-based vouchers are a component of a PHA's housing choice voucher program. The PHA administers the Section 8 contract and the funding, and is responsible for all of the administration responsibilities under the contract. The initial contract term is 15 to 20 years, and as discussed earlier, must be renewed. The PHA would perform the housing quality standards, unless, of course, the property is considered PHA-owned, and then an independent entity would perform the inspection. There is a choice mobility requirement built into project-based vouchers, wherein after 1 year of residency, a household can request a tenant-based voucher, and when one becomes available to the PHA, just from its natural turnover, they would provide it to the resident to move, at which point the owner would lease the unit that was vacated to another eligible household off the waiting list. Under project-based vouchers, rents are capped at the lower, and under RAD, the lower of current funding, the current funding public housing level. Reasonable rents are 110% of FMR, less utilities. Most often, the other rent caps don't come into play, and it's the public housing funding level, or the RAD rent, that is the governor of how the rents will be set. Finally, just to note that under RAD, certain project-based voucher requirements don't apply, including the requirement to competitively select project-based vouchers, income mixing, the project-based voucher program, and project-based voucher program cap. Now, for project-based rental assistance, it is congressionally appropriated through the project-based rental assistance account, which is one of the more consistently well-funded accounts at HUD. The contract and the funding is administered directly by HUD multifamily housing programs. Contract term is 20 years. The property is inspected by REAC, just as it is in public housing. There is also a choice mobility requirement, but it's modified such that the resident must live at the site for 2 years before it requests a voucher. The PHA can put certain limits on how many vouchers are provided for this purpose each year. It also has rent caps up to 120% of the FMR, or the current funding level, the so-called RAD rent. And again, it's the public housing funding levels, the current funding, that is typically the governor on where the rents are set. Moving on, we'll start talking through the various development requirements in RAD. So the basic conversion requirement is that PHA must show that it's assessed the capital needs of the property and has provided us a financing plan, a quote-unquote financing plan, that shows how it will cover all those needs, either or an upfront capitalization and or ongoing capital replacement reserve deposits. So it's showing us a schedule of capital needs, both immediate and long-term, and showing us that the property can financially support addressing all of those needs now and into the future. So this is one of the very key things that gets submitted with the financing plan, which we'll discuss later. All RAD conversions are subject to an environmental review. A Part 50 is done for PBRA conversions or for PBV conversions that are FHA insured, in which case HUD performs the review. Part 58 is done for all project-based voucher conversions that are not FHA insured, in which case the responsible entity performs the review. There is a requirement of RAD that PHA substantially converts all the assistance at the property, which is basically a one-for-one replacement requirement. So a conversion may not result in a reduction of the number of assisted units by the greater of 5% or 5 units. In practice, nationwide, this is less than 1%, but it adds this provides a little bit of flexibility based on property type and the realities on the ground. There's also an exception to this requirement when consolidating efficiencies or when there are long-term vacant units or units that will be used for supportive services. Moving on to site neighborhood standards. So all properties are converting under RAD are subject to site neighborhood standards. The owner or PHA must certify that the site meets site neighborhood standards. When there is new construction going on, HUD does a review itself, in which where we determine when the site is in an area of minority concentration, whether the site meets certain exceptions permitting development in those areas. On ownership and control, HUD, the RAD statute imposes certain requirements that the property must be owned or controlled by a public and nonprofit entity. This is usually done either with the PHA continuing to directly own the property, transferring the property to an affiliate, transferring to a nonprofit or public body. There's an exception to this statutory requirement wherein when using tax credits, the PHA the PHA at a minimum must maintain sufficient interest, which is often done through a long-term ground lease or a control agreement or some other instrument. Federal accessibility requirements apply to all RAD conversions. Frequently we see a scope of work that addresses the 5%, 2% requirements for minimum handicap units and that address common area deficiencies and things like that. And finally, Davis-Bacon prevailing wage requirements and Section 3 low-income hiring requirements apply to any initial repairs done as part of the RAD conversion. I want to take a moment to also talk about transfer of assistance, which is commonly proposed in RAD conversions. Transfer of assistance refers to a change in the geographic site of the assistance, has the potential to improve the location and quality of housing. So oftentimes public housing is not located in the best areas or areas that have since become less residential. Transfer assistance is a powerful tool then to move the assistance out of there and into a place where there's greater opportunity for low-income residents. When a PHA proposes a transfer of assistance, HUD assesses that the transfer doesn't place housing in neighborhoods of highly concentrated poverty and that there's a justification to leave the site in the first place. Some demonstration of economic non-viability or something of the sort. I'm going to spend the next few slides talking about resident rights and requirements, and breaking this up into three categories, so they overlap some. First is those rights and requirements related to residents prior to conversion. Second is those for residents at conversion, the residents of the site prior to conversion, and how they are grandfathered over into the Section 8 world. And finally, the ongoing rights of all residents, both those grandfathered and then the new admissions into the property post-conversion. So first, prior to conversion, prior to even applying for RAD, the PHA must hold 2 resident meetings with residents to discuss the application. Future meetings are required following CHAP issuance, as well as if project plans change, as they occasionally will. At the same time as those meetings, the PHA is providing the residents the RAD information notice, so residents have something in writing explaining the basic conversion plans. RAD conversions often trigger Uniform Relocation Act requirements, and so PHAs are also required to provide the GIN, or General Information Notice, which would alert tenants that they may be eligible for certain URA benefits. RAD conversion is so then moving on, post-CHAP award, RAD conversion is a significant amendment to the PHA plan. Frequently, PHAs, because the conversion process can take long enough, PHAs include the RAD conversion as they annually update their PHA plan, rather than through the significant amendment process. Either way is fine with us, as long as the public has had the opportunity to review the PHA's plans. PHAs are not permitted to relocate families until after the execution of the RCC, or the RAD conversion commitment. We'll get to the process in a little bit, about whether RCC lines up with everything. But that is primarily to make sure that residents are not relocated when the project plans are not fully baked. We don't want relocation can be disruptive, and we don't want relocation to occur when the deal ends up falling through and not actually happening. And finally, prior to conversion, residents may not be involuntarily displaced. This obviously flows beyond this moment in time prior to conversion, but at no point may a PHA direct a resident that they're not going to return to the property. Residents may accept voluntarily to take alternative housing options, to move with a voucher, or to take some other opportunity offered to them, but they cannot be forced to. Okay, so moving on to the rights of current residents at conversion. So residents, continuing with that theme, residents have a right to return to the property following any repairs or construction. The owner may not rescreen any residents upon move-in to the Section 8 property, whether that's happening immediately at conversion because residents are staying in place, or at a future time when the residents return from relocation. Because public housing and Section 8 have somewhat different calculations of how tenant rents are calculated, if residents, as a result, any residents will see an increase in their payments, then those increases can be phased in over a 3 to 5 year period. So this kind of buffers the increase for residents. And finally, these two items, if residents were participating in ROS or FSS or were benefiting from the earned income disregard, that can continue after conversion, but gets phased out as for ROS and FSS as those grants expire, and then for earned income disregard as the family graduates from that program. Then finally, both for residents that are at the property at conversion or grandfathered over, but also for new admissions going forward, RAD requires resident procedural rights that are outlined in Section 6 of the Act and detailed in the RAD notice that supplement existing Section 8 requirements. These do two things. One, ensures residents have an ongoing right to organize and receive resident participation funding, which is valued at $25 per unit per year, which comes from charged property expenses, and provides residents certain grievance and termination procedures consistent with what they enjoyed under public housing requirements. Finally, and very importantly, residents have a right to request a tenant-based voucher after a period of residency, and this is called the choice mobility option, which we described earlier, and the differences with that option for project-based vouchers or project-based rental assistance. Okay, just to touch on this again, but also slide into other areas on relocation. The URA applies whenever there is acquisition, demolition, or rehabilitation at the property. Oftentimes, the RAD requirements exceed what URA requires. Most importantly, as we discussed, residents have a right to return post-rehab, and no relocation can occur until the execution of the RAD conversion commitment. By the way, between the relocation requirements and all the pre- and post-conversion resident rights, we've developed really one of the most robust packages of resident rights of virtually any HUD program, which is something we're very proud of and take very seriously, and certainly expect that PHAs to take seriously in their as they implement the program. Just to touch briefly also on the relocation options that are often used, if there is a need for relocation. Lots of PHAs try to do it on site, either through checkerboarding or through short-term hospitality suites. They can offer residents other public housing owned by the agency or other affordable housing owned by the agency, offer private housing, or sometimes offer tenant-based vouchers, among other options. So I will take a little time to talk through the overall conversion process, just to give an overall framework. So it really starts well before you even come to HUD, which is the PHA does some strategic planning, thinking about what they want to do with their asset and what tools are available for them, which may or may not lead them to RAD. There may be other options that are preferable. But when the PHA decides that RAD is the right way to go, we have a simple RAD application, which the PHA fills out. The purpose of it is to confirm that the project is eligible for conversion under RAD, and the key eligibility requirement really being that the units are under the public housing ACC. We have a few other minor eligibility requirements that you should review in the RAD notice around very young Hope 6 properties, but the key thing is that the units are under public housing ACC. The other purpose of the RAD application is to ensure that the PHA has informed residents and the board of its conversion plans. So HUD receives the application. If there is space under the statutory cap, which is now 455,000 units, the HUD issues a CHAP, which reserves authority under the cap for that PHA, and it also sets forth what the contract rents will be. This is important because this is then the document PHAs use when they're talking with lenders and investors about and who will underwrite the deals. Once you have the CHAP, the PHA then has essentially 6 to 18 months to submit their financing plan. Financing plan is described above, presents the CNA and how the capital needs assessment and how the PHA will address the needs of the CNA, either through an upfront capitalization or through replacement reserve deposits. Financing plan also includes other due diligence like the environmental review and other things. Prior to submitting the financing plan, though, the PHA has to get other certain upfront approvals from HUD, including certain civil rights reviews, not just site neighborhood standards for new construction as described above, but also when there's a change in unit configuration or a change in occupancy, or a few other triggers that are detailed in the RAD civil rights notice. When there's a transfer of assistance, HUD would want to pre-approve the site where the assistance is going to. The PHA plan gets approved prior to financing plan, as do any proposed resolution of energy performance contract or capital fund financing program debt. So when those pre-approvals are gathered and the PHA has secured the rest of the components of the financing plan, it makes a submission. HUD takes 60 to 90 days to review that financing plan, and if it is found that the project is physically and financially viable and the conversion will comply with all program requirements, HUD issues a RAD conversion commitment, which approves the financing plan and sets out the terms of closing as well as of construction, the agreed to scope of work that the PHA will take on if necessary to repair any capital needs identified. The PHA and its counsel submits a closing package of draft documents, reviews, approves, and everybody moves towards closing, which entails removing the units from the public housing ACC by taking them out of PIC and releasing the public housing declaration of trust. then replaced with a Section 8 HAB contract and a RAD use agreement recorded at the property. And it's at this point that any construction financing closes as well. So where there is rehab or construction, that would commence at the time or soon after the HAB contract is executed. Then during that rehab and construction period, which could be anywhere from 0 months to 2 years, depending on depending on the scope of work, that work is done, and when the work is done, the owner comes back to HUD and lets us know. Okay, so then we will wrap up with just some quick update on where we are with RAD today. We have over 93,000 public housing units that have been converted over the last 5 years. That's covering over 850 properties. These conversions have generated over $5.4 billion in new construction investment. So this is net of acquisition costs and lawyer fees and other things. This is actual funding that's going towards the improvement of the properties. So this is something we're very proud of. It's also worth noting, so the RAD cap is now at 455,000 units. We have space under the cap to make awards to additional units, which we are about to do for the nearly 100,000 units that have accumulated on the waiting list. HUD has proposed in its FY19 budget to eliminate the cap so that all public housing properties can convert if they wish to. Take a moment just to say that as we've looked at the data, we haven't found any trends in where or in which PHAs RAD has worked better or worse. From what we see, RAD's operated successfully by PHAs of all different sizes and across the U.S. and with a wide range of rent levels, and there doesn't seem to be any clear trend that RAD works better or worse in particular areas. Clearly, one of the big limitations is that the rents are not always adequate to address immediate long-term capital needs, right, and cannot support much financing. And so that's one of the critical things that any PHA considering RAD should look at, and that's, as I mentioned, the RAD inventory assessment tool, its main purpose. But we think that every PHA ought to look at those numbers carefully and make their own determination. That's it for now. We just want to remind you that we have many more resources available on our website. You can also email us with questions. Also want to remind you that there are many, many more resources we have available that go into greater detail on the individual topics described here, including flexibilities on rents and the capital needs assessment, and how to submit a successful financing plan. And we look forward to hearing from you more in the future. Thank you so much.